Good afternoon. I'm wearing the beret, so I won't look the same in all these. I'm sure it adds quite a distinguishing element. It's my Mexican beret. Actually, it's a British design beret that was made in Taiwan, based on a French version of a beret. So it's global. Okay, and it's pre-tariff, so it was cheaper than, I don't know what's going to cost now. Okay, so the third major item I'm going to bring to you, and it's very major, is the communicative approach. Back starting in the early 60s, people began to get really, they're very dissatisfied with the audiolingual approach, and the old grammar translation had been around for hundreds of years virtually. And so there was a movement that to oppose the rigidity and the rather boring way that language was being taught. People thought that you don't teach grammar. Grammar doesn't make you a better writer, which is true. It only helps you to clean up your writing and help you just maybe after the fact. But for a person who's emerging in a language, neither of these were engaging, for sure. Now, the communicative approach is, and I have an example. I have a video called Mrs. Amin Teaches a Foreign Language Lesson in 2 different ways. And all you have to do is watch it, and you'll know from the first version to the second version that there is quite a difference. And I'll leave it at that, because until you watch it, it won't make, I'll just be describing it to you. I don't want to take away the fun of watching the video. Now, what's cool about the video, it's in a language I'm quite sure none of you know. And yet, if you pay careful attention, even in the first version, you can pick out a few words. And in the second version, even though no English is used, you will understand what the lesson is about. That's all I have to say about it. You have to watch it. So what are the principles? And I didn't put down here what the disadvantages are, because this is unfortunately, the word sea change is used too often by news people. They're always saying, it's a sea change, which means that language teaching got much more exciting, realistic, focused, interactive, promoted the meeting the needs of the student and working with the student at the level that you find them at. If they don't know English, you have to scaffold and construct lessons. You don't walk in and just open the textbook, whether it's, or use a tape and simply just teach the language as it's presented. You have to know about your student. So every approach after the communicative one that I'm talking about now, there'll be the natural one, there'll be a thing called the Rossius method, Suggestopedia. Some of them are very odd, but they're all very creative. And here's what I've got to say about this. Language is unique to the human species. I think other animals, whales and stuff, have their language too. It is a very creative thing, unlike B.F. Skinner and his behaviorism, which was the audiolingual, kind of followed along with that. Language is exciting. We use language because we're passionate about being alive. We, unfortunately, are subjected to language which is dull, boring, unengaging, etc. Every time you watch and there's some kind of a marketing deal or somebody's trying to sell you something, or you get a robocall. Yeah, they use language, but you shut down immediately. It's not engaging. So a lot of terms, I just mentioned some of them. Another one is context, comprehensibility, and interaction. I think I mentioned interaction. And I have all these listed. These are all the advantages. I don't have any disadvantages because we're talking about, I use the term sea change. I'm just talking about everything went a different way after the 60s and 70s. Now, unfortunately, there are people who still teach high school languages and they still teach with the old grammar translation. I've seen it over and over again, and I keep thinking this has got to change. This is not an appropriate way to teach. My daughter was taking a Spanish class once, and they got a guy that apparently spoke Spanish, but had never really taken any methodology classes. I don't even want to go into that. And his first lesson was to have the students who did not know Spanish at all, was to have them write a paragraph in Spanish. Now think about that. That would be like having a youngster who's a newcomer show up in your class and you have them write a couple of sentences introducing themselves when they don't even know how to speak. Okay. This is the kind of nonsense that goes on a lot of times. This communicative approach had huge, it was like an earthquake. It shook up a lot of people that were exploring on how to teach better, and unfortunately didn't hit everybody. And I made a list here, the principles of the communicative approach and the communicative language teaching. And then I mentioned something in here, and you'll see it. I'm just going to pick out a few things. You can drill. It doesn't say you don't drill ever. There is some value in practicing. For instance, maybe you have people memorize conversation so they can begin to at least say the words. And then you quickly, though, you don't teach that way all the way through. You allow people to make substitutions and alter the conversation once they're familiar with it. You also can use translation from time, but not the kind of translation you're thinking of. You don't go to Google Translate or something, write the word down or the sentence and then translate it into French or something and just slap it on the paper. But you're allowed to use context and try to figure out different ways to teach. Reading and writing can start from the first day. Now, here's something that's interesting, I think, is that you have listening, speaking, reading, and writing. We know that listening is the first skill. It's what you do when you first learn English. And a lot of this communicative competence is also going to be talking about the way we learn our first language. And we used to teach, and I remember in the 80s, they used to say that first languages are caught and second languages are taught. But in fact, you can learn the second language just like you learned the first one. Of course, you can't go back and be a baby again and grow up listening to French, so that you'll be fluent in French right out of the crib. But the idea is that you are given that many of the ways that you've learned your first language, for most of you English, you could learn a second language. And that means the teacher, and if you go and study in a foreign country, then it's a lot easier because then everything's already in that language and you have to pick up the clues. That's why study abroad is a huge advantage, okay? So meaning is paramount. You're focusing on actual communication and you want it to be accurate. So you don't learn things like the pencil is yellow or orange, whatever color you want to call that. We don't have weird artificial sentences. We focus on, oh, do you need a pencil? Oh, yes, I need a pencil. And then that would be the communication maybe in the language. And just to go back just a bit in the history, there's an approach called the Berlitz method. And it wasn't a major movement, but it was a way of teaching language back in the late 1900s, early 20th century. And what happened was they had a language instruction school, and I think they were teaching English, but it could have been German or French, whatever. And people would pay money and go and say, we're going to learn French. Well, they happened to hire this guy to teach, and he was going to teach French. And when he got to the place, he was a Frenchman, but he didn't speak any other languages. So that caused a problem. They thought, what are we going to do? Well, he taught anyhow. From the first day, he taught with context, and he spoke only French. And his students made great progress. I learned Spanish that way. When I started high school Spanish a few years ago, my teacher told us after the first day, that's the last time you'll use English in this class during the class period. And then people said, well, how can we learn Spanish if we don't speak English? You know, and some of you've had those foreign language classes where the foreign language wasn't used very much. People talked about it. It's kind of like a tour of France, only it's all being translated into English or something. And I always thought it was interesting because what it did is we were forced to listen for meaning from the first day. And by the time I finished my third year of high school Spanish, I was already functioning at a level of a junior who's majoring in Spanish in college. Our teacher had us reading 19th century Spanish plays. Now, we weren't very good at it, but we were doing work that we didn't realize that we were being challenged. One thing, if I pause for just a moment, you forgive me, is that we sometimes don't realize the incredible capacity of the mind to achieve so much. We spend so much time going over the lowest hurdles and making sure everybody can get over certain levels of whether it's math or science or whatever, that we don't realize that if we challenge people, they can do extraordinary things. Our class regularly talked in Spanish from the first week or two. And what our teacher did is he actually had us memorize about fitness. Why you can do some memorization. It's not a sin, but it's not the basis for the whole class. And we had to learn some phrases in Spanish. And one of them I can still remember, ojalá que se mejore pronto. I hope to God, o Allah, which is Spanish coming from Allah, because the Moors or the Arabs tribes, Islamic tribes, and the religion was established in Spain for many centuries before Christianity came back into Spain. And so there's a lot of Arabic in Spanish. If you ever, ajo, the word for garlic is Arabic. Azúcar, I always say it wrong. That means sugar, and it starts with an A. And you ever notice a lot of words in Arabic start with an A? Arithmetic. Arithmetic is from algebra, is from Arabic. A lot of the major advances in mathematics were done by scholars in Islamic universities who continued the Greek advances from the ancient Greeks. They translated and maintained a lot of the ancient texts, and that's why they were preserved for the Western Europe. And Western Europe acted like, well, we just found them and we rediscovered them. No, Islamic universities in Spain, in Damascus, in Egypt, promoted and kept human knowledge and civilization for many, many hundreds of years. So I just wanted to pontificate on that a little bit. But the point is that we learned some phrases in Spanish, and we instantly had things we could say. Some of them were silly. ¿Tienes pulgas? Do you have fleas? And you know, freshmen in high school, we thought that was just great to be able to ask that and laugh at people. Because let's face it, language is often used to insult people. Sense of humor, you always got to keep that going. So we learned how to pronounce the words. We did what we had to do. If we had to do a little practice and a little drill, but we didn't drill the whole period. We just did a few minutes until we picked up stuff, and then we moved on. And then we'd go back and practice it as needed. But there was always a context. And we always had a lot of fun in my Spanish class. And so I learned Spanish, and I learned virtually all my Spanish in high school. You know, my college courses weren't very good when I went to Truman State. That was a long time ago. But of course, it's different now. But that's, you know, to me, you're only as good as the teacher you have, right? And if your teacher sets high goals and doesn't really just challenges you all the time, you will achieve extraordinary things. So the communicative approach, in every sense, is focused on language use and language proficiency, and it works. And the ones I'm going to talk about after this, I'll talk about a thing called The Natural Way by Stephen Krashen. And I'm not giving you a lot of names with this because I'm not going to give you a test over memorizing who came up with this idea for language instruction. What I want you to remember is the communicative approach in the 60s brought about a revolution. And then people began to teach language like they meant it and like they live it. And the context was important. And in addition to that, knowing your students is very important. Now, some of you in my class, I didn't do it this time, but sometimes I have you do a thing called a culture map where you write, you can do it in a number of ways, but I could say to you, just show me where you're living and draw a picture of your area and recreational things you do or favorite places. And some people put a church, or others put a football field, and some put a library, and others had a guy put stock car race fields, whatever, arenas, whatever you want to call them. I'll think of it in a minute. But he put those all over Southwest Nebraska. This years ago, and I can still remember those. That he said, yeah, I go here, and there's one at Valentine, there's one at down in Kansas he'd go to, and he was actually, he would announce these. He was the guy on the speaker. And then he knew those, and he knew all the Chinese restaurants in Western Nebraska. And what was so cool about this is that I remember that stuff and those stories from that student long ago. I can't remember his name anymore. I know he was out of the North Platte area, but he had such an interesting story. And then you find out about people because they draw these pictures and they explain them and they use language. And of course, you can use the culture map. And some of you already know about this because I've used them before. And if you have my classes, I'll use it again, but I'm not doing it every time because some people say, oh, I just bring my old culture map. But you do some drawing and you put a context into your story. And language is based on stories, and that's really what we want to hear. Who are you? What do you do? Where'd you come from? And that's how language is. An audiolingual doesn't ask you about your story. And grammar translation, for the most part, doesn't ask you about your story. It's all focused on things outside of you. But language learning has to be in context and focused on the student so that they can tell their story. And then it becomes important. That's how you learn your first language. Remember your favorite pet, your favorite toy, your favorite ice cream. What did you do? When did you hurt your finger when you were in 5th grade? I cut the end of my finger off, the middle finger. I won't point it out to you. I cut it off in an old pump. Oh my God. But I remember that, and I remember the pain of having that piece of iron come down, chop the end of my finger off, and the doctor sewed it back on. Well, it's a story, and language is telling our story. And so that's why conversation and group work and interactivity is so critical, because fluency comes from telling these stories. I don't have the word story in there, and I didn't even intend to say the word story, but in fact, that is exactly what language is. So remember, when we talk about a communicative approach for meaning, telling our story, and those terms, motivation, context, comprehensibility. I mean, if you can't be understood, you can't tell the story. You may have to draw pictures, and you can think of all the situations where you deal with people and maybe you don't speak their language, but you can point at things, and you can, you know what's interesting about pointing at things? Apparently the apes, chimpanzees and stuff, do not understand if you point at something. Like if I point and say, go over there, it's over there. Now we understand that immediately, but apes don't. But dogs do. If you point at something, a dog will get it. That is such a weird thing. You'd think a chimpanzee is much smarter than a dog. But apparently there's certain things, and we don't know what that is. I'm getting off track, I'm sorry. But there's certain things in our interaction with different animals over long periods of time that we develop a communication, because humans and dogs have been cooperating with each other for untold thousands of years. Not so much cats. You never see any cave paintings of pet cats in a cave. I have 4 cats in my house where we just moved, and all I do is I just push them out and let them in. Push them out the door and let them in. I think I can communicate with cats, but I believe they're still indifferent. They're terrible English learners. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that, and I want you to take that to heart. And in the next group I talk about next week, I'll be talking about the natural approach, the Rossius method, a thing called Suggestopedia. And I love talking about these because they're just kind of bizarre. People came up with different ideas. People even tried hypnotizing people to learn the language, but I don't think it really works that well. It's great for stage acts, but you can't build a civilization on hypnotizing people to speak Spanish. Excuse me. Okay. Well, thank you very much.